Welcome to Books at Berklee. I'm your host, Judy Pinnolis, Associate Director for Instruction and Engagement at the Berklee Library. We welcome today Dr. Joshua Walden. Josh is the author of Sounding Authentic, The Rural Miniature and Musical Modernism, and the book for our discussion today, Musical Portraits, The Composition of Identity in Contemporary and Experimental Music. He is the editor of the volumes Representation in Western Music and The Cambridge Companion to Jewish Music. Dr. Walden received his PhD from Columbia University. He previously taught on the faculty at Peabody Conservatory at the Johns Hopkins University and now practices law in the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome, Dr. Walden, to Books at Berklee.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, Judy.
Well, first, I just wanted to say that there is so much good material in this book. Nearly every page had some things I wanted to remember. So I wanted to ask you first, how did you come up with your theme for this book, blending an interest in art and music?
I've always loved the visual arts. I considered majoring in art history and studying art history in university, but because I was a violinist and I loved music, I don't know, maybe even more, or I felt it more physically because I created it. I'm not a good artist. I majored in music. I went to graduate school in music and I pursued that path. But I always felt that I wanted to find a way to connect the two, or to figure out how our perception of music and our perception of the arts, visual art, also literature, are maybe correlated a little bit more closely. And I think in music, there's a tendency to talk about it, maybe mystify it a little bit as something that stands outside of the other art forms, that's more abstract, that's kind of harder to get to, more ineffable. That's not necessarily my experience of music. Of course, there's an abstraction. Of course, it can be maybe representationally less specific than visual arts or literature. But I found that I'm not perceiving these different art forms in a completely different way. So I spent a lot of years while I was working on Jewish music and nationalism and kind of the subject of my dissertation and my first projects. I spent a lot of time trying to find a way that I could sometime in the future work on a subject that brings visual art and music together and lets me explore how perception works in these two fields. And I ended up thinking that portraiture was a kind of a helpful inroad for me, maybe for a couple of reasons. One is because it is a genre that's more typically associated with visual arts. I think we think intuitively that a portrait is going to be visual because it has to represent a likeness. It has to represent much more than that. But first and foremost, most portraits represent a likeness. And since you can't do that in music, that seems to pose a fundamental problem. How can you have a musical portrait in the first place? So I wanted to be able to try to study that question. And then the other was it gets us to a sort of larger issue that's on everybody's mind, which is what is identity? What is the self? How do we define who we are and how do we interpret who other people are? Portraiture lets you do that in all different genres. So I wanted to kind of be able to get in that direction too and kind of allow that to let me say maybe why this matters a little bit more than simply just how I see and how I listen.
Well, a striking element of the book is the front cover with some parts of the painting missing. And I was intrigued by the blurred out face. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what it represents for this book? Or
Yeah, sure. I love that painting, and I found it by chance. I mean, I shouldn't say I found it. It was in an exhibit, and I just happened to walk by it. It was an incomplete an incomplete portrait, a portrait that was being painted of somebody, and it just didn't get finished. And so the features of the face, they're sort of ghostly, but they aren't defined. And then the dog was not painted really at all. There's a kind of a shape, a place for it. But
yeah.
what I love about this portrait, I'm looking off to the side because I have it here. What I love about this portrait is that it has all of these other markers of this person's identity. You can't see what she looks like. You can't see what her dog looks like, but she's holding a ring. Maybe that represents that she's married, or maybe that represents riches. I don't know. She's holding a key. Maybe that represents a sort of access to something. Again, I don't need to get too specific, but it has a sort of a symbolism. She's covered in all these different colors of satin robes. That certainly puts her in a certain social class. It certainly puts her in a certain status. She's sitting on a gilt chair. So we have all of these symbols of character, of identity, of social status, of who she is, but we don't have her likeness. And what I like about the portrait, in addition to the fact that, well, like a musical portrait, it doesn't portray a likeness, but it is a portrait. What I like about it is it conveys, I think, pretty immediately how a portrait, even without showing you what somebody looks like, can tell you a lot about who that person is. And that's what I think musical portraiture does. It can't tell you what a person looks like, but it can actually tell you a lot about the person.
Well, yeah, it's so intriguing because of the nature of what's it's able, what's left out. I was wondering if you could tell the audience a little bit about how you went about investigating these different pieces of music and art for inclusion in your book. I mean, there's so many different pieces that you investigated and matched up in the book.
My interest in looking at musical portraiture was, as I said already, not just to kind of study the genre and how it works. It was to look at how music and other art forms kind of coalesce together, or how they correspond with each other, maybe how they differ from each other. And so as I was looking around to find different musical portraits, I found some of celebrities and some of political figures, and I thought they could be interesting. I definitely wanted to look as case studies of portraits of people who I thought the reader would know about or could easily find out about. So that, I mean, I think it's just a richer experience to probably look at or listen to a portrait of somebody who you're aware about. So you can see which aspects of the person's character, of the person's bearing, are there in the portrait. But I started to find that one thing that composers were doing was composing portraits of people in the arts. And I thought, well, what a better way to look at how people are using music to convey something about literature, or the literature of a particular individual, the art of a particular individual. So I decided that the way I would do it is in a four chapter structure that builds up to the multimedia portrait of Einstein on the beach, which brings together literature, art, and music in a very abstract way to create this huge scale portrait of Einstein. So the first chapter, I wanted to focus on portraits of literary figures, and I found Boulez composed a large portrait of Mallarmé, and Virgil Thompson composed portraits of literary figures and was very inspired in writing hundreds of portraits by the literary portraits of Gertrude Stein. So that was a way to bring together music and literature and look at how musical forms are being used to kind of evoke, portray, stylize the literary styles of the people who were being represented in these portraits. And in the second chapter, I looked at musical portraits of painters. So how does Philip Glass portray the persona, the character, and also the art form of the portraitist Chuck Close? And how does Morton Feldman do the same with the artist Willem de Kooning? And then the third chapter, it's music kind of turning in on itself. How are composers composing the music, music to really to portray themselves in a self-portrait? So how does George Ligeti look at his own music, his own history, and convey that in a piece of music? And then how does Peter Ablinger do the same? How does he convey his music, what he hears, who he is through music? And the way they do that is they kind of give you a sense of what they hear when they listen to their own music, when they listen to the sounds around them in the city, when they listen to the music of other composers, and they use that as a way to convey themselves. And I thought that this was a fun way for me to look at kind of correlations between the different art forms, how they get at the same thing together, and also how perception of literature, of art, of music factors into a composer's sense of an artist or of his own or her own identity.
You brought out very well this dance between the media of the arts and music, and how the composers were trying to get at pulling these ideas from one medium to the other. And I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about this compositional methodologies that you discuss in your book, how the composers actually created a technique to produce these kinds of artistic, representations a little bit.
Yeah, of course. That was one of my favorite things that I found while I was looking at these case studies. And I mean, I have to say, to one degree, it's interpretive. So I'm finding this in here in the music as I listen to the music, as I study the score. So somebody else might find something different, and it's not necessarily a definitive discovery or anything like that. But I think that's also one of the things that I wanted to do. I wanted to do subjective analysis of the music because I think that's what we do when we listen, when we view art, and when we're looking at portraiture or listening to portraiture. But there's definitely, in my view, a sort of correlation that composers are creating in the way that they style their music in these portraits to the artistic styles of their subjects. An example is, for example, Gertrude Stein wrote hundreds of literary portraits, and these can be short written portraits of people. She says who it's a portrait of, and then puts some words together. It doesn't necessarily, it's very abstract, these portraits. They don't necessarily say anything specific about the person who they're representations of. But there's a lot of repetition, a lot of use of sounds and assonances and contrasting vowels, and that sort of repetition can be found in Virgil Thompson's musical portraits. So the two were friends for years. He was really inspired by her literary portraits. Something else he did was actually he used her way of writing a literary portrait to inspire the way that he composed a musical portrait. So she would sit down like a portrait painter and write a literary portrait in front of the sitter, whatever words came to her mind, whatever sorts of rhythms and patterns she came up with. And this is something that Virgil Thompson started to do. He would compose his musical portrait sitting, looking at his subject, composing the music as he looks at the person, trying to convey something about the person's presence. The idea was an abstract portrait that conveys not what a person looks like or what a person is dressed as, but just they have this idea of kind of presence of the energy of the person in front of you.
There were all kinds of these different approaches. There were so many different approaches to how the composers tried to capture that. And it was, there were so many different ways of approaching the composition and capturing elements or aspects or characteristics of the person.
Absolutely. I mean, you find in Boulez's portrait of Mallarmé that he's using musical forms to evoke Mallarmé's poetic forms, but there also seems to be a kind of overarching narrative to the way that the piece, starts with a little bit more formalistic clarity and ends up with abstraction that mimics the poet Mallarmé's own trajectory from something more meaningful to a symbolist poetry that was so abstract it was hard for his peers to understand. You find that with Philip Glass's portrait of Chuck Close, that he's using a sort of more traditional musical narrative form, let's say from major to minor and major again, to convey Chuck Close's, early years, a challenge he had in the middle of his life, and then his later happiness in painting to convey the narrative of his biography, but also using music to convey Chuck Close's painterly style. So Philip Glass uses little musical cells with additive rhythms. Sometimes the cells get a little longer, sometimes they get a little shorter. That's something that Chuck Close did. He created large-scale heads, large-scale portraits of people, but built of small, what he called lozenges, little squares or diamonds of color layered on top of each other. And the colors change a little bit gradually, just like Philip Glass's structures. So Philip Glass's musical structures are emulating or symbolizing or a metaphor, however you want to put it, for Chuck Close's. And I think that what that tells us is a few things. I think it lets us look at the portrait as saying that Chuck Close's identity, who he is, his self, is somehow defined by Chuck Close's artistic style, that there's a connection or sort of autobiography in there. But also, I mean, what I found interesting about Philip Glass's piece is that that's, of course, something that you could say Philip Glass does in all of his music, is small structures of music that are, build and gradually or subtract gradually, but repeat each other. But maybe that means that Philip Glass is finding part of his own identity in his connection with Chuck Close, who was a friend of his, who was doing something similar, in the minimalist stylings that they both developed in different art forms, that he's finding a kind of a connection between the selves. And so I think this is something that portraiture lets composers do. It lets them find a way to emulate different artistic styles. It lets them find a way to represent people who they know, who they care about, or who they're interested in. But it also maybe lets them explore their own musical techniques and how they can be representational of themselves and of something else.
It made me think that, a look backward in time to see how maybe not as intentionally as these composers approached it, but how other composers in their own day, how their music reflected the arts around them in a more direct way than maybe we have thought about in the past. One of the things that also I was thinking about when I was looking at this book was, you're not including score. You don't have little snippets of score like a lot of music books do.
Yeah.
And although it seemed to me that the book would work well in a classroom if there was a class that was looking or examining compositional technique, contemporary music, and how it is interplays in the thought of the day. Was this book initially conceived of as a textbook, or is that just my own looking at this, how it might work?
It
Um,
wasn't conceived of as a textbook, although I mean, I would love it to be used that way because I hope that it can be used, at least parts of it, in part of in the context of educating people on and letting graduate students and undergraduates think about connections between how they experience different art forms. I mean, I always tried in all my writing in musicology to write in a way that would hopefully be accessible to students, try to avoid too much jargon and too much just try to be clear so that it could be used in education. And I did use it in my own teaching. But I'm with you in the lack of musical score being a deficit, and that's just it's one of the challenges of publishing about contemporary music or about music from the last century. The expense of persuading a music publisher to give you the rights to show a page of a score, it ends up costing too much money, and so there are just limits. Because I was also an Oxford University Press was really generous about letting me include a lot of images. And so I was writing museums, getting the rights to paintings. I was writing galleries also. And then I was also writing these publishers. And at some point you just say, I'm tapped out of the money that I can spend.
yeah,
So it's an unfortunate thing. I think the book is no question aided by having the score next to you, having the music, something that, available to listen to or to stream.
I just thought that maybe our library would put up like a list of the pieces of music and uh, link to our resources of those pieces of music. If someone wanted
That'd be
to read this
wonderful.
book, and maybe put a link, get a link added to the note field or something. I've been playing with that idea because it would be such a wonderful thing to have that list of music as well as the portraits as approach this, and as you have the descriptions that you give in the book about how the composer approached this and all this background information, which was so wonderful. It just seems that listening to the music as you go along, and then you can more envision what you're talking about, would be really helpful. Um, I just was impressed also by this wide range of styles that you give, all the time periods, and you cover all these methods, and the multi-dimensional aspect, the multimedia aspects of the project, going into the genres, and you touched on that a little bit already. Is there one particular piece you'd like to point out to our listening audience that you feel worked especially well um, on your premise of the book?
Yeah. So I've already spoken about Philip Glass's portrait of Chuck Close, and I think that works very well. Another one, a piece that I found really intriguing when I was studying it was um, George Ligeti's self-portrait, and it's a group self-portrait. So it's a piece for two pianos, and it's a portrait. It's called Self-Portrait with Reich and Riley. That's Steve Reich and Terry Riley, and then in parentheses and Chopin in the background. So Chopin is like this ghostly presence. Obviously, he's from a different era. They didn't live at the same time, but somehow he's in the background of this portrait. It almost conjures the image of these three people together with Chopin's apparition somewhere behind them. And somehow he manages to create this music that evokes the sounds of the compositions of all three in the context of creating a portrait of himself. I don't think that this piece, without its title, would be any more awkward in Ligeti's canon. It sounds like a piece by George Ligeti. It uses the kind of phasing and the kind of piano stylings of any other piece by Ligeti. But once he gives you the title, he kind of takes you on this journey, allows you to start listening through this lens. So George Ligeti developed in Hungary a lot of his musical techniques. He came to America and he learned of the music of Steve Reich and Terry Riley, the minimalist composers, and he got to know them. And he found that they were developing some techniques at the same time that really were similar to each other. And he found this fascinating, that even though they didn't have access to each other when he was in Hungary and they were in America and he hadn't heard their music, they were developing techniques that were similar. He wanted to convey that by writing music that is in his own style, but then also uses the phasing of Steve Reich, the minimalist stylings of Terry Riley, and brings them together in this very ebullient, very kind of loud and bangy piano piece for two pianists. It's a complicated piece. It's sort of hard to wrap your head around. You've got to really study the score and figure out what's going on. But as you start listening, you can hear the music of Ligeti. It sounds like him. It sounds kind of like typical Ligeti. But you can also start to hear the Steve Reich. You can hear the Terry Riley, and you can hear him doing this kind of comparison of music from across the globe. And one thing that I love about that is it's Ligeti listening to his own music. So it's not just Ligeti composing and letting you listen to his music. It's Ligeti letting you listen to, or letting you hear what he hears when he listens to his music.
Yeah,
And
so
yeah, and that's how it's a self-portrait. So it's a self-portrait of his perception of his music. It's a self-portrait of his perception of itself. You know, when a painter paints a self-portrait, very often in the history of self-portraiture, you'll see the painter's brush, the maul stick, the palette, maybe even the edge of the canvas. Painters often paint themselves in self-portraits with the tools of their trade. And that's something that Ligeti is sort of doing. He's composing his self-portrait with this real pianistic style, with these stylings that, you know, kind of are so typical of him. And he's saying, listen to my music, but listen to it as an example of my music in a way. It's a little bit complicated, but I think it works as a self-portrait. And then at the end, there's this very kind of Ligeti-esque fantasy on a Chopin piece. And it ends, you can hear Chopin kind of emerging through the fog of all of these piano bangings. And that's where Chopin comes in. And I think part of what he's saying too is, okay, all three of us develop this music alongside each other, or I should say separately, but at the same time as each other. We all admire each other's music, but also Chopin is part of our lineage, right? And we're listening to Chopin, and here's what we hear when we listen to Chopin. It's a kind of Ligetian Chopin or a Steve Reichian Chopin. So I think I think that piece it's a short piece, but it's a little gem. It really is a fascinating portrait.
Yeah, these are just amazing insights. And I think that, you know, our listeners are going to go back to these pieces of music for sure.
I hope
And
so.
new ways of hearing them and thinking about them and kind of jumping into, you know, more interpretation. You know, there's so much subjective nature to interpretation, you know, to begin with. And I, you know, was thinking about our audience, if they were starting, you know, our students, if they're starting to investigate for themselves, you know, these series of musical portraitures, you know, kind of this gives a place to start, and then they can go off and maybe create some of their own similar ideas or interpretive work, you know, reactions to these works. Well, I mean, the role of the artist and the perceptions of creative work have dramatically changed, you know, over time. And we talked a little bit about, you know, can these ideas be applied retroactively to other centuries and so on. And I was just wondering, is there, out of all of the investigations that you made, was there, I don't know, you've given us some really good examples of some of the work that worked well and so were very fascinating. After all of this investigation, what made, I guess one thing that you'd like the audience to take away as they approach your book and some of these ideas that are represented in your book, what would be like one thing you'd ask someone to focus on?
The other studies that I've written that I wrote before this book were really about, what music meant in a certain particular historical era, music's social meanings, what composers were trying to convey, and they really were in a way more historically minded. And when I wrote this book, I started by thinking about that. And I definitely looked at what the composers thought about identity, about the self, about music, what the composers said about the subjects of their paintings. I loved to look into the history of of their compositions. I wanted to look into the history of the subjects of these compositions. But really, I decided pretty early on that what I wanted to do was just dig into subjective analysis. This composer has given us this piece. He or she has told us that this piece is a portrait of this individual. Here's what we know about this individual, a little bit of background, and this is how this piece works for me as a portrait of this individual.
Yeah.
And I wanted to have fun with the subjective analysis, and I wanted to kind of make space for that and allow students or readers to think, I can do this too. I can do subjective analysis, and there aren't any boundaries. Don't necessarily have to link it to exactly what the composer thought he or she was doing, or what people at a certain time would have interpreted it as. I guess my takeaway is music is something that we should listen to and subjectively interpret and have fun with. It's not a rejection of historical study and historical analysis. I think that's incredibly important. But I think as listeners, we should just have fun and we should interpret and we should do our analysis and we should allow other people to disagree or other people to bring up aspects of the music that we think are interesting that affect our analysis. And we can think about how that makes music a part of our own identities, a part of our own subjectivity. That's something that portraiture and self-portraiture let you do. If you're looking at an artist's self-portrait, you're thinking about what it is that that artist thinks kind of creates his own identity, amounts to his own self. But that lets you kind of sit back and think, how would I portray myself? What is it that goes into my identity? What is my identity now? And how does it compare or contrast with my identity 10 years ago? I think these more musical portraits do something very similar. They allow us to think, to interpret, to think about how do we listen to music? What does music mean to us? What do the stylings of a certain composer convey? What images do they kind of bring to mind? And what does that tell us about our perception? And what does our perception tell us about who we are? How does our musical listening become part of our identities? It's a kind of a long-winded answer, but I guess it's just have fun with interpretation. And then if you want to let yourself think about who you are and how your interpretation guides you toward a sense of self.
And what you said totally rings true to me because, here at Berklee, we have a lot of folks involved with all kinds of different genres of music, jazz and popular and rock and all of that. And everything that you said about these aspects of, having fun and interpretation and, looking at the identity of it, I think can be applied to all of those other forms of music, as well as these kind of contemporary classical pieces that you presented in this book. So I would recommend the book to students who are whatever genre they're studying and whatever music they're invested in creating and looking at and investigating. The techniques and the ideas presented here, I think, will apply to them as well. So I really appreciate you talking about this book and coming to talk to us at Books at Berklee. It's wonderful to have you with to present this item and to hear your ideas and the fun that you had investigating these pieces of music. It's very exciting.
It's
Thank you.
my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.